The Instagram account that would later become central evidence in an international murder investigation still exists, preserved as digital memorial and stark warning about trust misplaced in dangerous circumstances. The final posts from Sarah Mitchell's profile show a vibrant 30-year-old Colorado nurse posing against breathtaking Turkish landscapes, the otherworldly rock formations of Cappadocia, ancient ruins along the Aegean coast, colorful marketplaces in Istanbul. Her captions documenting what began as attendance at a college friend's destination wedding, but transformed into extended solo adventure that she described as finding my soul in this magical crossroads of East and West. The photographs from her last 6 weeks alive reveal subtle changes that investigators would later identify as warning signs hidden in plain sight. A new man appearing with increasing frequency in her images, her messages home becoming less regular, and eventually, concerning shifts in her appearance, including noticeable weight loss, diminished smile, and final photos where her typically confident gaze seemed replaced by something more guarded, her eyes showing what friends and family would later describe as a shadow we all missed until it was too late. Detective Murat Demir of the Izmir Police Department's Special Investigations Unit would later describe the Mitchell case as revealing the perfect predatory pattern that transformed what should have been a carefree travel experience into calculated victimization that exploited cultural disorientation, isolation from support networks, and romantic idealization of cross-cultural connection that blinded an otherwise intelligent woman to escalating danger signals until escape became impossible. The investigation uncovered methodical grooming by a practiced manipulator who had targeted multiple foreign women before Sarah, though none with such devastating consequences, establishing a timeline of calculated exploitation that began with seemingly serendipitous meeting at a beachside cafe in Fethiye and ended 90 days later with her body discovered in a remote canyon outside Izmir. Her disappearance having finally generated the international media attention that forced local authorities to overcome initial reluctance to investigate thoroughly when a foreigner vanishes after extending a tourist visa. Sarah Mitchell had arrived in Cappadocia on a typically beautiful May morning, the kind of picture-perfect day that fulfills every tourism brochure promise and reinforces Turkey's reputation as ideal destination for experiencing ancient wonders alongside natural beauty. Her initial one-week itinerary centered around college roommate Rachel Carter's destination wedding, with plans including traditional pre-wedding celebrations, the ceremony itself against spectacular landscape of rock formations and hot air balloons, and several days of group excursions before most of the wedding party, including the bride and groom, would return to their professional lives across the United States. Text messages and social media posts from this period show Sarah in her element, organizing impromptu group hikes, researching best local restaurants beyond tourist zones, and generally serving as enthusiastic ambassador, leveraging her previous international travel experience and natural extroversion to enhance everyone's experience of Turkish hospitality and traditions. The decision that would ultimately place Sarah in fatal danger came during the final days of the wedding celebration, when she announced to surprised friends that she had decided to extend her one-week vacation to a full month, planning to explore the Aegean coast before eventually returning to her travel nursing assignment in Denver. This spontaneous extension reflected both her adventurous personality and specific life circumstances. She had recently completed an intensive 3-month nursing contract in Seattle, accumulated substantial savings from higher-than-average pandemic-era nursing rates, and arranged extended time between assignments, specifically to attend the wedding with possibility of additional travel, depending on how she felt once in Turkey. Friends later recalled mild concerns about her solo travel plans, though these were largely alleviated by her previous independent international travel experience, outgoing personality that easily formed connections wherever she went, and clear excitement about exploring beyond typical tourist experiences in a country whose cultural diversity and natural beauty had clearly captivated her from the moment she arrived. The digital breadcrumbs that allowed investigators to reconstruct Sarah's final months revealed how her travels progressed from mainstream tourism to increasingly off-the-beaten-path experiences, with her social media documenting transition from luxury resort areas to more authentic neighborhoods, local frequented restaurants, and eventually locations accessible primarily to those with local connections and transportation. The investigation would establish that the critical turning point occurred approximately 2 weeks into her extended stay, when Sarah first encountered Sem Kaya at a beachside cafe in Fethiye. Their meeting documented in what appeared to be spontaneous group photo that she posted with caption, "When your waiter turns out to be a fellow adventurer with the best local tips. Number travel magic, number new friends, number Turkish delight." This seemingly chance encounter, investigators would determine, actually represented calculated targeting by someone who had observed her dining alone on multiple occasions, identified her as traveling independently through observation, and recognized vulnerability masked as confidence. The relationship between Sarah and Sem developed with disarming normalcy at first, their early interactions following familiar pattern of tourist local friendship that countless travelers experience without tragic outcomes. He showed her hidden gems of coastal towns, introduced her to authentic experiences beyond guidebook recommendations, and presented himself as worldly local, eager to share his culture with appreciative visitor. Text messages to friends back home during this period reveal Sarah's initial enthusiasm, describing Sem as so knowledgeable about places tourists never find, and sharing excitement about experiencing the real Turkey beyond the postcards. The digital trail shows her original return flight to Denver, canceled approximately 3 weeks into her stay, coinciding with increasing appearance of Sem in her social media posts, and first subtle indications of isolation, as her communication with friends and family became less frequent, and regular video calls with her sister inexplicably stopped. Despite previously consistent weekly schedule they had maintained during all her previous travels. The investigation would eventually establish through witness testimony and electronic evidence that Sem Kaya's interest in Sarah represented not spontaneous connection but calculated targeting, his pattern of behavior consistent with what domestic violence experts recognize as love bombing, followed by increasing control, isolation, and eventual exploitation. His background, obscured through deliberate misrepresentation during their relationship, included previous complaints from foreign women travelers alleging emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, and controlling behavior that had never resulted in formal charges, partly due to challenges victims faced pursuing complaints after returning to their home countries, and partly through his strategic dissolution of relationships once financial or other objectives had been achieved. Sarah's particular vulnerability lay in combination of her extended solo travel status, natural openness to new experiences, and financial resources that made her attractive target for both emotional and financial exploitation through romantic manipulation that previous victims had escaped before situation escalated to violence that would ultimately claim Sarah's life when her eventual recognition of manipulation and attempt to leave triggered fatal rage in someone who viewed relationships through lens of possession rather than mutual respect. The warning signals that appeared in Sarah's communications during her final weeks in Turkey reflected textbook patterns of isolation and control, though their gradual intensification meant no single message triggered sufficient alarm among friends or family to prompt intervention before it was too late. Her once frequent social media posts decreased in both frequency and detail, with fewer photographs of herself and more generic tourist images. Video calls with family members stopped entirely, replaced by sporadic text messages offering various technical explanations for inability to connect visually. Messages to close friends became increasingly delayed and brief, with concerning statements like, "Cell service is really spotty in these remote areas," and "Sem knows all the best places that don't have tourist Wi-Fi," that domestic violence experts would later identify as classic excuses suggested by controlling partners to explain communication reduction. Most troubling was the communication pattern itself, with reduced frequency, interspersed with occasional bursts of contact that seemed designed to prevent anyone from becoming concerned enough to take action. A manipulation technique investigators would determine likely represented Sem's monitoring and potentially controlling her communications rather than Sarah's own natural patterns. The final weeks of Sarah Mitchell's life remain partially obscured, despite extensive investigation, with gaps in the timeline that may never be fully reconstructed due to deliberate evidence destruction witness intimidation, and inherent challenges of building case when victim was isolated from regular contact before her disappearance. What investigators established with certainty is that approximately 75 days into what had begun as one-week wedding attendance, Sarah made documented attempt to return home, booking flight from Izmir to Istanbul, connecting to international departure that she never boarded. Her final communication came through brief email to her sister, approximately 12 hours before scheduled departure, stating simply, "Something feels off with Sem. Coming home tomorrow. Don't want to explain now, but will call when I land in Istanbul." This message, which would later be identified as critical evidence indicating her recognition of danger and attempt to escape, was followed by complete communication silence that family members initially attributed to travel complications, but which investigation would determine represented the period when Sem, confronted with her planned departure, responded with violence that transformed controlling relationship into homicide. The official investigation into Sarah Mitchell's disappearance began far too late to prevent tragedy, initiated only after repeated, increasingly desperate inquiries from family members who had gone from concerned to alarmed during 2 weeks of complete communication silence. The delayed response reflected troubling patterns in how missing foreigners are sometimes treated by authorities in tourist regions. With initial reports dismissed, with suggestions she had likely just traveled to area with poor cell service or chosen to extend stay without informing family. Assumptions that wasted critical early investigation time and allowed for evidence destruction that significantly complicated subsequent prosecution. Only when her case generated social media attention through campaign, orchestrated by her friend Rachel, and pressure from American consular officials did serious investigation begin, eventually leading Detective Demir to surveillance footage, witness testimony, and finally physical evidence that revealed not accidental death or random crime, but deliberate homicide following controlling relationship when victim's attempt to leave triggered fatal violence from someone who viewed her departure as unacceptable rejection rather than basic exercise of personal autonomy. The nursing career that defined Sarah Mitchell's identity beyond her love for travel reflected both professional excellence and personal values centered around care for others, with her choice of travel nursing, specifically allowing combination of healing work with passion for experiencing diverse communities and cultures that colleagues described as central to her worldview. Her specialization in emergency nursing demonstrated both technical skill and emotional resilience, handling high-pressure situations, and qualities that paradoxically may have contributed to her vulnerability through confidence, navigating challenging environments and belief she could handle difficult situations that more cautious individuals might avoid. This professional background had created not only financial flexibility, allowing extended international travel, but also perspective on human vulnerability that friends described as making her particularly compassionate toward others, while perhaps insufficiently protective of her own well-being when caring instincts extended toward people who ultimately did not deserve the benefit of doubt. Her naturally empathetic nature tended to provide. The destination wedding that brought Sarah to Turkey had been planned over 18 months, with her college roommate Rachel selecting Cappadocia for its spectacular landscape and unique accommodation options, including cave hotels carved into the region's distinctive rock formations. Sarah's particular enthusiasm for the location connected to her long-standing interest in places where natural wonder and human history intersect, with text messages to friends before departure, showing excitement about hot air balloon rides over the unique terrain and opportunities to explore underground cities dating back centuries. Her role during wedding festivities extended beyond typical bridesmaid duties to include impromptu tour guiding for guests less experienced with international travel, with wedding videos showing her confidently navigating local transportation options and helping others overcome language barriers through combination of basic Turkish phrases she had studied before arrival and natural gift for cross-cultural communication that didn't require perfect language fluency. The friendship between Sarah and Rachel had begun during their freshman year at University of Colorado, where they had been randomly assigned as roommates, despite seeming initial differences. Rachel, the more reserved pre-business student from Chicago suburbs, and Sarah, the outgoing nursing major from rural Colorado whose previous travel had been limited, but whose curiosity about the broader world was already evident in her voracious reading about distant cultures and landscapes. Their unexpected bond formed through complementary strengths, Sarah drawing out Rachel's hidden adventurous side, while Rachel providing grounding pragmatism that occasionally tempered Sarah's impulsivity. This dynamic continued through their decade-long friendship, with Rachel privately expressing concern about Sarah's extended stay plans, while respecting her independence and trust in her judgment that previous solo travels had generally validated, despite occasional situations requiring last-minute adaptations that Sarah had always navigated successfully before this fatal misjudgment about someone whose dangerous nature she recognized too late. The pre-existing travel experience that gave Sarah confidence for solo exploration following the wedding included previous independent journeys across Southeast Asia, Central America, and parts of Europe, establishing pattern of initially joining group tours or attending specific events before extending trips independently to explore beyond standard tourist itineraries. This approach had created both legitimate skill, navigating unfamiliar environments, and perhaps excessive confidence that may have contributed to vulnerability through reduced caution, despite previous journeys occurring in different contexts with better communication infrastructure and more established tourist presence than the remote coastal areas where her relationship with Sem eventually led her. Friends noted that while her previous solo travels had included occasional concerning situations, her natural social intelligence and careful risk assessment had generally served her well until this tragic misjudgment about someone whose manipulative skills specifically targeted the trust-building process that had reliably protected her in previous travel contexts. The extended friend group that witnessed Sarah's last carefree days during the wedding celebration later provided investigators with crucial baseline understanding of her typical behavior, communication patterns, and decision-making processes before Sem's influence began. Their collective testimony established her as adventurous but not reckless, independent but maintaining regular communication with loved ones, and typically exercising good judgment about personal safety, despite enthusiasm for authentic cultural experiences beyond standard tourist paths. This understanding helped investigators identify significant deviations in her behavior and communication patterns once Sem's controlling influence took hold, creating contrast between her typical travel approach and the troubling isolation that developed in her final weeks when regular check-ins with family and friends mysteriously ceased, despite her previously consistent communication and habits during all international journeys. Regardless of location, remoteness, or technical limitations, she had always previously found ways to overcome. The initial post-wedding exploration, documented through Sarah's enthusiastic social media, showed genuine excitement about architectural discoveries and natural beauty along Turkey's western coast, with particular focus on ancient ruins at Ephesus, traditional village life in places tourist buses typically bypassed, and dramatic coastal landscapes where mountains meet the Aegean Sea. These early independent explorations, occurring before Sem's regular presence emerged in her timeline, showed authentic engagement with both historical sites and contemporary Turkish culture, without indication of the manipulation that would gradually emerge as he systematically inserted himself into her experience through calculated encounters that initial investigation dismissed as coincidence, but which more thorough examination revealed as deliberate targeting based on observation and strategic approach to traveler who fit victim profile. His previous patterns established. The relationship development between Sarah and Sem followed textbook grooming patterns that domestic violence experts would later identify as classic methodology, beginning with genuine value provision through knowledgeable guidance and practical assistance that established credibility and trust foundation before transitioning toward control mechanisms introduced incrementally to normalize relationship dynamics that more objective analysis would immediately identify as problematic, but which gradual implementation made difficult to recognize from within developing situation. Early interactions focused entirely on meeting her stated interests through access to locations off standard tourist path, cultural context, enhancing her experience, and practical assistance navigating language barriers or transportation challenges. This value-forward approach established dependency through genuine service before introducing control elements that might otherwise have triggered caution, creating relationship foundation where his local knowledge represented significant enhancement to her Turkish experience that she would become reluctant to sacrifice even as troubling elements began emerging within dynamic that had initially seemed ideal enhancement to her independent exploration. The digital evidence documenting relationship evolution revealed Sem's systematic methodology through location pattern analysis, with initial encounters occurring exclusively at public locations, before gradually transitioning toward increasingly private settings, as trust, established through legitimate knowledge sharing and experience enhancement, created foundation for isolation that more objective analysis would immediately identify as concerning, but which incremental implementation normalized through graduated exposure. The photographic timeline showed clear progression from cafe meetings and group activities where other tourists provided ambient security through public presence, toward remote beaches with limited visitor numbers, and eventually private excursions to locations completely separated from tourist infrastructure or observation opportunities that might have created witness perspectives, had the exploitation pattern been recognized before fatal conclusion. When her attempt to leave triggered violence that transformed controlling relationship into homicide, the communication pattern changes that family members retrospectively identified as warning signs emerged gradually, rather than suddenly, reflecting Sem's sophisticated understanding of isolation techniques that too rapid implementation might have triggered intervention. The methodical approach included initial enhancement, where his contributions actually increased her communication through exciting discoveries and experiences worth sharing, followed by subtle redirection, introducing technical explanations for reduced contact, including connectivity limitations in remote areas, scheduling activities during typical communication times, and eventual suggestions about excessive digital connection, undermining authentic travel experience that domestic violence experts immediately recognized as classic isolation tactics, but which appeared reasonable within context of exploring beyond tourist infrastructure. This graduated implementation transformed Sarah's typically consistent communication pattern toward increasingly irregular contact without triggering immediate alarm that sudden silence might have created, establishing isolation through incremental changes that individual family members observed partially, but which comprehensive pattern analysis would have immediately identified as classic control mechanism had collective observations been systematically compared before tragedy made retrospective analysis the only option remaining. The control mechanisms that Sem gradually implemented followed patterns domestic violence experts immediately recognized as textbook methodology despite unusual context of travel relationship rather than traditional domestic setting, with techniques specifically adapted to exploit vulnerability factors unique to international travelers, separated from normal support networks, and navigating unfamiliar cultural and legal systems without clear understanding regarding available resources or appropriate expectations. The approach began with seemingly reasonable suggestions that incrementally increased isolation while appearing to enhance authentic travel experience, including recommendations about disconnecting from technology to fully appreciate cultural immersion, suggestions about avoiding tourist trap accommodations in favor of local options lacking international communication infrastructure, and eventually practical transportation dependency through remote locations, accessible only through his vehicle rather than public options that might have maintained independent movement capability had she recognized concerning dynamic before isolation was completely established. The witness testimony from various business owners and local residents along Turkey's Aegean coast established timeline details investigation otherwise couldn't reconstruct, given limited digital evidence from period after Sem achieved significant isolation, with hotel operators, restaurant staff, and shop owners providing crucial observations about relationship dynamic evolution, showing clear progression from apparently genuine connection toward increasingly concerning interaction patterns. Observers recognized as troubling but lacked intervention mechanism to address. Particularly significant was elderly pension owner in small coastal village who reported overhearing argument approximately 2 weeks before Sarah's disappearance, with her questioning about return to larger city meeting, aggressive resistance, followed by what witness described as frightening change in Sem's demeanor when she mentioned flight booking, creating such concern that witness attempted offering transportation assistance, before Sarah's apparent reassurance that situation was under control prevented intervention. That witness later expressed profound regret about giving Subsequent events that additional investigation might have prevented had warning signs received appropriate response before situation escalated to violence. The financial control elements that emerged approximately 5 weeks into relationship reflected classic exploitation methodology, beginning with practical assistance, managing currency exchange, and local payment systems, before transitioning toward holding her credit cards for safekeeping due to alleged theft concerns in certain areas, controlling access to ATMs through transportation limitations to locations where withdrawals could occur, and eventually direct access to her financial resources through phone access, enabling banking app manipulation. Investigation would later document through transaction timing analysis, showing withdrawals occurring during periods witness testimony established Sarah couldn't have physically accessed banking systems herself. This financial control created practical dependency, complementing emotional manipulation and physical isolation, establishing comprehensive vulnerability through systematic elimination of independent resources that might otherwise have facilitated escape once she recognized dangerous dynamics, but faced significant practical barriers to independent movement without access to financial resources, transportation options, or communication systems, not subject to his monitoring and control. The psychological manipulation techniques demonstrated sophisticated understanding of trauma bonding processes, despite Sem's lack of formal psychological education, with approach showing instinctive implementation of methods, creating emotional dependency through alternating affection and criticism. Intermittent reinforcement patterns, psychological research has established, create particularly powerful attachment responses and strategic undermining of self-confidence through subtle criticism, disguised as cultural guidance that gradually reconstructed her self-image around his approval, rather than internal validation systems that previously guided her typically confident decision-making. This methodology created powerful emotional dependency, even as objective assessment of relationship dynamics would have immediately identified concerning control patterns, demonstrating how even intelligent, experienced individuals can become gradually entrapped through psychological manipulation, specifically designed to create emotional bonds resistant to rational analysis. Once, isolation has separated victims from external perspectives that might otherwise provide reality check regarding problematic dynamics, developing incrementally enough to normalize before becoming recognizably dangerous. The location progression tracked through digital evidence and witness statements revealed strategic movement toward increasingly remote areas as relationship developed, creating physical isolation, complementing psychological manipulation and financial control that collectively established comprehensive dependency, difficult to escape despite growing recognition of troubling dynamics. The movement pattern showed clear progression from popular coastal towns with substantial tourist infrastructure, including transportation connections and communication systems, toward increasingly isolated villages accessible primarily through private transportation, and finally, remote nature areas where witness opportunities became nearly non-existent and dependency on SEM for basic needs, including food access, transportation, and communication became nearly absolute. This geographical isolation strategy reflected sophisticated understanding regarding vulnerability creation through elimination of practical escape options and potential witness observations that might otherwise have created intervention. Opportunities before controlling relationship escalated to physical violence when Sarah's eventual escape attempt triggered fatal response from someone who viewed relationships through possession lens rather than mutual respect. Framework that would have acknowledged her fundamental right to leave regardless of his preferences. The turning point that investigators identified approximately 70 days into Sarah's Turkish journey came through rare, unsupervised internet access at Coastal Town Cafe, where surveillance footage showed her using public computer terminal while Sem conducted business meeting nearby, with subsequent email records revealing flight booking from Izmir to Istanbul, connecting to international departure scheduled 3 days later. This independent action, taken during brief window without direct monitoring, demonstrated both her recognition of troubling relationship dynamics and attempt at self-protection through planned departure that evidence suggests she initially attempted implementing without direct confrontation, likely hoping to frame decision as natural conclusion to extended travel rather than rejection, that someone with Sem's psychological profile might interpret as unacceptable challenge to control, requiring response beyond manipulative tactics that previously maintained relationship control, but which potential departure threatened beyond repair. The confrontation that ultimately turned controlling relationship fatal occurred at isolated rental cabin, approximately 30 kilometers outside Izmir, with evidence indicating Sarah revealed departure plans only after securing flight booking and making preliminary arrangements. Expecting reaction would likely be manipulative rather than immediately violent based on previous controlling behaviors that had employed psychological rather than physical methodologies. The forensic evidence recovered despite significant time between death and investigation initiation suggested argument escalation from verbal conflict through physical restraint attempt and ultimately fatal violence, with defensive wounds indicating active resistance and evidence of restraint preceding fatal injuries suggesting extended struggle rather than momentary loss of control. Sem's subsequent statements attempted characterizing this evidence pattern, combined with witness testimony about his previous controlling behaviors and systematic isolation preceding fatal confrontation, contradicted defense claims regarding impulsive reaction to unexpected revelation, instead suggesting escalation pattern consistent with domestic violence. Homicide research showing highest danger period typically occurs when victims attempt separation after controlling relationship establishment. The homicide staging that initially created accident classification reflected calculated response rather than panicked reaction, with evidence showing significant interval between death and body placement in canyon location where eventual discovery occurred. The positioning and conditions suggested hiking accident rather than intentional violence, with personal items strategically arranged to support accidental fall narrative, including camera placed as though victim had been photographing scenery before losing balance. This staging demonstrated both premeditation through calculated evidence manipulation and sophisticated understanding regarding investigative limitations affecting accident versus homicide classification, particularly regarding foreign victims in tourist regions, where authorities sometimes demonstrate reluctance pursuing complex investigations without compelling evidence, contradicting simpler explanations that tourism-dependent regions generally prefer to accident determinations carrying fewer negative publicity implications than violent crime acknowledgement would generate. The investigation that Detective Murat Demir ultimately conducted faced significant institutional resistance, reflecting both tourism protection priorities within Turkish enforcement structures and resource limitations affecting case prioritization when involving foreign visitors without diplomatic pressure, ensuring appropriate attention. His personal commitment to case resolution despite these obstacles represented professional dedication, transcending institutional limitations, with his methodical approach systematically overcoming official reluctance through carefully documented evidence development, establishing clear homicide determination that jurisdictional authorities could no longer reasonably dismiss as accidental death. Once comprehensive case building created irrefutable evidence pattern, requiring official acknowledgement and appropriate response allocation, despite institutional preference for accident classification carrying fewer negative implications for regional tourism than violent crime acknowledgement might generate. The international pressure that ultimately ensured appropriate investigative resource allocation emerged primarily through social media campaign orchestrated by Rachel Carter, whose strategic approach combining emotional appeal through personal storytelling with systematic communication, targeting media outlets, diplomatic channels, and tourism officials created multi-layered pressure, impossible to dismiss through standard redirection techniques officials might otherwise have employed to minimize potential tourism impact. The campaign's effectiveness particularly reflected Rachel's professional communication background with her marketing career experience, enabling sophisticated strategy development that simultaneously generated public awareness, creating accountability pressure while engaging appropriate diplomatic channels, ensuring official attention without creating unnecessarily antagonistic approach that might have hindered rather than facilitated cooperation necessary for effective investigation within foreign jurisdiction where family lacked direct influence beyond pressure. Mechanisms strategically deployed through carefully constructed campaign, balancing emotional appeal with diplomatic engagement. The evidence collection process faced significant challenges given both time interval between disappearance and investigation initiation and SEM's deliberate evidence destruction efforts, with crime scene processing, discovering cleaning chemical residue, indicating systematic sanitization attempt that forensic analysis determined would have successfully eliminated most standard evidence detection methods but failed to address advanced techniques Detective Demir employed through specialized training, including international certification programs providing expertise beyond standard local procedures. The crime scene reconstruction particularly benefited from his methodological approach, applying advanced techniques that enabled evidence recovery standard processing would have missed given sophisticated sanitization efforts reflect SEM's awareness of basic forensic limitations, but insufficient knowledge regarding advanced detection capabilities. His cleaning attempts failed to defeat, despite superficial scene processing that less thorough investigation might have, accepted as indicating absence of evidentiary value, requiring more sophisticated examination. The digital forensics that provided crucial investigative foundation required exceptional international cooperation, with Turkish authorities working through diplomatic channels to access records from American service providers, including cloud storage accounts, financial institutions, and communication platforms that documented critical timeline elements. Cleaning attempts couldn't eliminate from virtual evidence landscape, despite SEM's device tampering preventing direct access to communication records. Local investigation alone might have failed to recover. This international cooperation reflected both diplomatic pressure, ensuring appropriate resource allocation, and Detective Demir's professional network developed through previous international training programs, creating direct connections with counterparts, facilitating expedited information, sharing outside standard bureaucratic channels that might otherwise have created delays, potentially compromising time-sensitive investigation aspects requiring immediate evidence preservation before standard procedural timelines could complete through official channels, sometimes requiring weeks for information requests that case urgency couldn't accommodate, given both justice requirements and continuing public attention, ensuring accountability for appropriate investigative progression. The witness testimony that transformed theoretical case into prosecutable homicide came through Detective Demir's methodical community canvassing, extending beyond standard tourist areas into local neighborhoods where Sarah and Sem had been observed during relationship progression, with residents providing crucial observations regarding interaction pattern evolution, showing increasing control dynamics preceding disappearance. Particularly significant was elderly shop owner whose business faced rental cabin where final confrontation occurred, with his observations documenting both regular appearances during preceding week and concerning interaction patterns, including argument the evening before Sarah's disappearance, where raised voices prompted consideration about potential intervention before cultural hesitation regarding involvement in what appeared domestic matter prevented action. He later expressed profound regret about, given subsequent tragedy. This testimony established crucial timeline element, showing relationship deterioration and verbal conflict escalation preceding disappearance, creating significant evidence regarding progression from controlling behavior toward physical confrontation. When Sarah's planned departure threatened relationship continuation, Sem apparently considered non-negotiable despite her clear intention. Ending arrangement, his controlling behaviors had transformed from initial seemingly mutual connection into increasingly restricted situation she had recognized as requiring escape before fatal escalation occurred when departure attempt triggered violence rather than acceptance. The financial investigation provided crucial motivation evidence through comprehensive transaction analysis, documenting systematic account access pattern, showing withdrawals from Sarah's accounts during periods witness testimony, established she couldn't have initiated personally, creating clear documentation regarding financial exploitation component, providing secondary motivation beyond control issues when her departure would have eliminated both emotional possession, satisfaction, and practical financial benefits. Ongoing relationship provided through access to her substantial travel nursing savings. The analysis particularly benefited from international banking cooperation, facilitating comprehensive transaction history access that standard local investigation might have struggled to develop without specialized financial investigation. capabilities Detective Demir accessed through economic crimes division collaboration that typical homicide investigation might have lacked without his recognition regarding case complexity, requiring multidisciplinary approach beyond standard procedural templates, potentially missing critical financial motivation aspects. Less comprehensive investigation might have failed to properly document despite central importance regarding both specific case resolution and pattern. Recognition preventing future implementation through similar methodology other potential victims might otherwise face. The surveillance camera footage that provided crucial timeline documentation required extensive canvassing beyond standard investigation parameters, with Detective Demir's team identifying private business cameras beyond public security systems. Official investigation might have exclusively relied upon without recognition regarding coverage limitations in areas lacking government monitoring systems. This comprehensive approach identified crucial movement documentation standard canvassing might have missed, with material from small business security systems providing vital documentation, establishing last known movements before disappearance, and contradicting Sem's initial statements regarding separation timing before Sarah's supposed independent travel. He initially claimed preceded her disappearance, but which footage conclusively disproved through documentation showing them together significantly after claimed separation. This contradiction provided critical interrogation leverage, eventually contributing toward confession, following confrontation with objective evidence, eliminating plausible deniability regarding continued contact despite initial statements, suggesting no involvement with her movements during critical period when disappearance occurred. The body recovery that finally occurred following comprehensive search operation, utilizing both traditional methods and innovative techniques, reflected Detective Demir's recognition regarding disposal methodology, likely employed given perpetrator background, local geography knowledge, and transportation access constraints, limiting practical options for concealment. The search strategy specifically prioritized remote canyon locations accessible through specific vehicles Sem had documented access to, with tire impression analysis from rental cabin security footage, establishing vehicle model utilized during critical overnight period when body transportation likely occurred based on timeline reconstruction. The eventual discovery in remote canyon location, approximately 30 kilometers from Izmir, represented area requiring both local knowledge for identification and appropriate transportation for access, with location selection reflecting Sem's regional familiarity but insufficient understanding regarding forensic investigation capabilities. Modern techniques provide, despite remote location and staging efforts, that basic search might have failed to identify without comprehensive approach, employing both traditional search patterns and technological assistance, including drone surveillance, covering extensive terrain. Physical teams alone couldn't efficiently process, given vast potential search area. The autopsy findings, despite body condition, challenges given environmental exposure during approximately 3-week interval between death and discovery, provided crucial cause determination through comprehensive examination, identifying blunt force trauma consistent with pre-mortem struggle, defensive injuries indicating active resistance, and fatal cervical fracture, suggesting manual strangulation during physical confrontation rather than accidental fall staging attempt, had been designed to suggest. The medical examiner's detailed analysis established not only homicide determination, but specific methodology, suggesting face-to-face confrontation rather than surprise attack, with injury pattern analysis indicating defensive wounds on forearms, consistent with conscious resistance attempt, rather than unexpected assault without opportunity for protective reaction. This detailed determination provided important prosecution elements beyond basic homicide establishment, with specific injury patterns supporting premeditation arguments, contrary to Sem's claims regarding momentary anger without prior intention, positional evidence suggesting deliberate rather than impulsive action. Physical analysis, clearly documented through comprehensive examination, despite challenging conditions. Less thorough investigation might have deemed insufficient for detailed determination beyond basic homicide classification. The confession that Sem Kaya eventually provided following extended interrogation represented partial acknowledgement rather than complete admission, with his statement accepting responsibility for physical confrontation, resulting in death, while maintaining characterization as accident during argument, rather than intentional homicide evidence clearly established through comprehensive forensic analysis. This limited admission reflected strategic approach, attempting punishment minimization through voluntary manslaughter characterization rather than murder charges. Substantial evidence supported, with his narrative emphasizing momentary anger following relationship disagreement rather than culmination of controlling pattern. That evidence comprehensively documented through witness statements, financial records, communication analysis, and physical evidence. Reconstruction, collectively establishing systematic control methodology preceding fatal violence, when victim's escape attempt triggered lethal response from perpetrator, whose relationship approach fundamentally centered around possession rather than mutual respect, that would have acknowledged her basic right terminating relationship regardless of his preferences. The testimony from Nihan Özdemir, Sem's former girlfriend, provided crucial pattern evidence establishing Sarah's experience, represented methodology implementation rather than isolated incident, with her account documenting nearly identical approach, including initial charm and apparent perfect compatibility, before gradually increasing control mechanisms, isolation techniques, and financial exploitation attempts she had recognized and escaped before similar escalation could occur. Her testimony particularly established behavioral patterns, contradicting defense characterization regarding cultural misunderstanding or relationship miscommunication, instead documenting calculated methodology. Sem had refined through multiple implementations with foreign women, travelers sharing similar vulnerability factors, including solo travel status, financial resources, and unfamiliarity with local systems, creating dependency. His approach specifically exploited through initially legitimate assistance, gradually transitioning toward control mechanisms, introduced incrementally enough to normalize before becoming recognizably restrictive to someone experiencing manipulation from within relationship dynamic, specifically designed to create both emotional attachment and practical dependency simultaneously. The defense strategy centered on cultural misunderstanding narrative, attempting to establish relationship conflict as resulting from communication failures rather than deliberate control methodology, with particular emphasis on differences between Turkish relationship expectations and American independence assumptions, creating framework for arguing fatal confrontation, represented tragic accident during emotional argument rather than culmination of controlling pattern evidence comprehensively established. This approach faced significant challenges from prosecution, evidence development, contradicting miscommunication characterization through systematic documentation, showing deliberate rather than accidental isolation, financial exploitation rather than cultural confusion regarding money management, and physical evidence indicating homicide, followed by staging rather than accidental death during unplanned confrontation. Defense narrative attempted establishing, despite evidence conclusively demonstrating deliberate actions, inconsistent with accident theory, physical evidence systematically contradicted through comprehensive forensic analysis, impossible to reconcile with version events. Defense presented despite vigorous attempts reframing evidence through cultural context. Framework prosecution, effectively dismantled through expert testimony, establishing universal standards regarding personal autonomy, transcending specific cultural contexts, despite defense attempts suggesting alternative interpretation. Framework evidence simply couldn't support, given comprehensive documentation establishing clear homicide determination. Medical evidence conclusively confirmed beyond reasonable dispute, regardless of cultural context considerations. Defense attempted centering despite fundamental incompatibility with physical evidence scientific analysis objectively established. The verdict delivered by the three-judge panel, following Turkish criminal procedure, established guilty finding on charges, including second-degree murder, evidence tampering, and financial fraud, with judgment specifically rejecting cultural context claims, given evidence establishing pattern, transcending specific relationship circumstances, while acknowledging partial confession as mitigating factor justifying second rather than first-degree conviction. Prosecution had sought based on premeditation evidence they had presented through comprehensive timeline development. The sentence, imposing 20 years imprisonment, represented substantial punishment under Turkish legal framework, with judicial remarks specifically addressing how case reflected predatory targeting, requiring comprehensive response, Rather than viewing incident as isolated tragedy or momentary failure of judgment, evidence clearly established represented pattern culmination rather than aberration. The judgment particularly noted how evidence established methodical victim selection, calculated relationship development, and deliberate control progression that psychology experts testified represented classic domestic violence pattern, despite unusual context of travel relationship rather than traditional cohabitation situation, with dynamics fundamentally reflecting universal control methodologies adapted to specific circumstance rather than cultural misunderstanding. Defense had unsuccessfully attempted establishing, despite evidence comprehensively contradicting, such characterization through systematic pattern documentation. Independent witnesses from multiple backgrounds had consistently described, despite having no connection beyond separate observations of identical controlling behaviors, preceding fatal violence when victim's departure attempt triggered response consistent with domestic violence homicide research, showing separation attempt following control. Establishment represents highest danger, period, regardless of specific relationship, context, or cultural background factors. The international media response following case resolution reflected troubling patterns in reporting about violence against women generally and foreign victims specifically, with initial coverage emphasizing travel danger narratives that subtly suggested personal responsibility through traveling alone in high-risk locations rather than recognizing calculated targeting by predator, whose methodology would have presented danger regardless of specific destination, given deliberate victim selection process focused on vulnerability factors present in solo travelers across any geographical location. This framing evolved somewhat as case details emerged through court proceedings, with later analysis exploring universal patterns of control, isolation, and violence that domestic violence research has established transcend specific cultural contexts, despite sometimes manifesting through locally relevant mechanisms that superficial analysis might misattribute to cultural factors rather than recognizing as universal control methodologies adapted to specific environmental circumstances, but fundamentally reflecting behavioral patterns documented across diverse geographical and cultural contexts worldwide. The diplomatic engagement following case resolution included formal discussions between Turkish and American governmental representatives regarding enhanced cooperation frameworks for cases involving foreign victims, with particular focus on expedited information sharing, improved missing person response protocols, and coordinated support services addressing unique barriers affecting travelers experiencing crime abroad. These conversations acknowledged both investigative complexities when evidence spans multiple countries and specialized victim support needs when navigating unfamiliar legal systems while processing trauma far from established support networks. The resulting protocols established improved coordination mechanisms, addressing institutional gaps Detective Demir had overcome through extraordinary personal commitment and international relationship development that standard procedures had not adequately facilitated, creating systematic improvements rather than relying on exceptional individual efforts that might not be consistently available in future cases involving similar jurisdictional complications. The psychological impact on Sarah's family created complex grief complications extending beyond normal bereavement, with traumatic circumstances, international complications, and awareness regarding systematic predation that might have been prevented through appropriate pattern recognition, creating particularly challenging recovery, requiring specialized support, addressing both loss processing and justice engagement extending across international boundaries, creating additional complexity beyond typical grief resolution processes. The support resources specifically developed through community organization, establishing Memorial Foundation, addressing both Sarah's specific case and broader traveler safety needs, created meaningful framework, transforming tragedy into prevention opportunity that family members described, providing partial healing through meaningful purpose development, ensuring Sarah's experience might protect others from similar vulnerability despite painful knowledge their loved one's death might have been prevented through earlier pattern identification, that system limitations unfortunately failed, providing despite multiple previous reports, documentation indicated existed before fatal escalation occurred. The institutional reforms implemented within Turkish tourism security structures following the case included enhanced training programs for officers likely to encounter foreign visitor reports, with particular focus on recognizing how cultural differences, language barriers, and unfamiliarity with local systems create unique vulnerability factors, requiring specific response protocols rather than standard approaches, developed primarily for domestic crime patterns. These improvements, developed through collaborative effort between Detective Demir and international partners, addressed specific barriers that had initially delayed effective response to Sarah's disappearance, creating systematic enhancements rather than relying on exceptional individual efforts that standard procedures had not adequately supported. The resulting protocols particularly emphasized timely response recognition, enhanced evidence preservation standards, and coordinated communication with foreign authorities whose assistance might prove crucial for digital evidence development given jurisdictional complications affecting direct access to international service providers. The enduring impact of Sarah Mitchell's case extended far beyond individual justice resolution to inspire systematic improvements in both traveler safety measures and institutional responses when prevention efforts fail, creating meaningful legacy that transformed personal tragedy into catalyst for changes potentially protecting countless future travelers from similar victimization. The Sarah Mitchell Foundation, established by her family with support from both American and Turkish partners, developed comprehensive education programs addressing realistic risk awareness without promoting fear-based isolation, culturally informed safety strategies, balancing openness with appropriate boundaries, and resource identification, ensuring travelers know how to access assistance if concerning situations develop during international experiences. These initiatives specifically targeted gap between generic travel safety advice and practical reality of cross-cultural relationships, providing nuanced guidance, acknowledging both genuine connection possibilities and specific vulnerability factors, requiring thoughtful navigation rather than either fearful avoidance or naive assumption that personal experience. Independence provides sufficient protection against sophisticated predatory behaviors, specifically designed to bypass normal caution mechanisms. The relationship between Rachel Carter and Detective Demir evolved from professional cooperation necessitated by investigation into lasting friendship, representing rare positive outcome emerging from fundamentally negative circumstances, with their continued connection, providing foundation for international education initiatives, helping travelers recognize warning signs they had initially missed despite general awareness regarding potential travel risks. Their partnership particularly focused on developing concrete guidance regarding specific behavioral patterns, requiring caution beyond generic warnings. Travelers often find difficult applying to seemingly positive relationship developments without clear understanding regarding gradual control escalation techniques. Predators specifically employ targeting vulnerability factors unique to international travelers, separated from normal support networks. This collaboration created educational resources bridging gap between abstract safety suggestions and practical recognition regarding specific warning indicators that personal experience alone often fails identifying before control. Patterns become established through incremental implementation, creating relationship dependency that may become apparent only after isolation, makes assistance access particularly challenging through deliberate limitation mechanisms. Predators specifically develop preventing intervention once vulnerability has been established through sophisticated manipulation techniques refined through multiple implementations, following similar patterns despite superficial customization appearing coincidental without pattern recognition. Education specifically facilitates. The travel nursing community that had formed significant part of Sarah's professional identity developed specialized safety protocols following her case, with particular focus on supporting members pursuing international experiences during assignment breaks through enhanced communication systems, check-in protocols designed identifying potential problems before escalation, and emergency response frameworks addressing unique challenges when colleagues experience difficulties abroad. These resources specifically addressed vulnerability factors travel nurses face given their often substantial financial resources, independent personalities, and comfort navigating unfamiliar healthcare systems that collectively create confidence, sometimes extending beyond areas where professional competence transfers directly to personal safety assessment, despite contextual differences, creating risk factors, requiring specific awareness. Their medical training alone might not adequately prepare them, recognizing without additional education regarding predatory behavior patterns, particularly targeting their demographic given both financial resources and helping personality characteristics, potentially creating vulnerability without specific awareness regarding manipulation techniques, refined, specifically exploiting caring instincts. Their profession naturally selects and enhances through professional development, focused appropriately on patient care, but potentially creating personal vulnerability without counterbalancing awareness regarding how those same positive characteristics might be weaponized against them through manipulation techniques, specifically designed exploiting caring instincts. Predators recognize as potential vulnerability, despite representing positive personality characteristics in appropriate contexts. The documentary film 90 Days, Sarah Mitchell's Story, premiered 3 years after her death, presenting balanced examination of both case specifics and broader issues affecting vulnerable travelers without sensationalism or victim-blaming narratives. Earlier media coverage had sometimes employed creating misleading impressions regarding actual risk factors and practical prevention strategies that realistic preparation might address without unnecessary fear generation, potentially undermining positive cross-cultural experiences that appropriate education might actually enhance rather than prevent, through specific risk awareness, enabling confident rather than fearful travel, through concrete knowledge regarding specific warning signs, observation, beyond generic caution that practical application often finds challenging, maintaining throughout extended international experiences. This thoughtful approach helped transform Sarah's story from sensationalized travel danger narrative into nuanced examination of universal control patterns, requiring specific recognition capabilities beyond general awareness that practical experience often provides inadequately without specific education regarding predatory methodologies, specifically designed appearing initially positive before revealing controlling aspects, only after isolation and dependency have created significant barriers to straightforward separation without assistance. That isolation specifically prevents accessing through mechanisms deliberately developed, eliminating external perspective that might otherwise identify concerning patterns before situation. Escalation creates significant danger that earlier recognition might effectively prevent through appropriate boundary establishment before control patterns become fully implemented through graduated exposure, normalizing increasingly restrictive dynamics that sudden implementation might immediately trigger rejection, but which incremental introduction often successfully establishes through careful calculation regarding appropriate escalation. Pacing predators specifically calibrate, avoiding premature recognition before dependency establishment creates significant departure barriers, potentially triggering violence when control faces challenge through separation attempts. Representing greatest danger period, domestic violence research has consistently identified, regardless of specific relationship, context, or geographical location where control dynamics develop. The international standards development that emerged from advocacy efforts established important frameworks addressing cross-border protection requirements, appropriate response protocols spanning jurisdictional boundaries, and recognition systems establishing clear understanding regarding universal rights application, transcending specific cultural context, despite strategic emphasis on selected traditional elements, frequently mischaracterized to justify inappropriate restrictions, serving control maintenance rather than reflecting authentic cultural practices accurately understood beyond superficial characterization. These standards particularly address jurisdictional complexity, creating practical protection limitations despite theoretical safeguards citizenship status should provide, establishing clear guidelines regarding appropriate intervention regardless of geographical location, cultural context, or legal system variations, creating barriers to straightforward assistance, despite clear rights violations established through objective analysis, transcending specific relationship, classification questions that technical legal perspectives might emphasize, But fundamental human rights considerations supersede when addressing basic autonomy, protection, representing universal standard beyond specific cultural tradition or geographical context, despite strategic use of select cultural elements serving justification purposes, rather than reflecting legitimate practices accurately understood within appropriate contextual framework beyond superficial characterization, employed primarily to rationalize control rather than honor genuine tradition. The personal transformation that Sarah's family experienced throughout their grief journey extended far beyond justice, pursuit toward meaningful legacy development, ensuring their daughters' and sisters' experience might protect others through educational resources. The foundation developed specifically addressing vulnerability factors she had encountered without recognition regarding danger. Indicators education might have identified before control patterns became established through incremental implementation, creating relationship dependency that became apparent only after isolation made assistance access. Particularly challenging through limitation mechanisms, SEM had specifically developed preventing intervention. Their journey from grieving family toward educational advocates represented meaningful purpose development, transforming personal tragedy toward broader protection. That foundation development specifically facilitated creating legacy, ensuring Sarah's experience continues, providing protection long after case resolution through educational resources, addressing specific vulnerability factors. Travelers navigating unfamiliar environments frequently encounter without appropriate awareness regarding exploitation methodologies. Systematic predators specifically develop targeting particular vulnerability situations. International travel frequently creates without specific education regarding danger. Recognition that detailed case examination more effectively provides than generic cautions, practical implementation often finds challenging, maintaining throughout extended international experiences, despite theoretical awareness general. Travel advisories might provide without specific methodology recognition. Detailed case studies more effectively illustrate. The lasting legacy of Sarah Mitchell ultimately transcended both sensationalized media narratives and legal proceedings to create meaningful change in how solo travel safety is understood, with her tragic death catalyzing important conversations about balancing adventure with awareness, recognizing universal warning signs across diverse cultural contexts, and developing informed safety resources that acknowledge specific challenges without reinforcing harmful stereotypes or creating barriers through inappropriate fear generation, potentially undermining positive cross-cultural experiences that appropriate education might actually enhance rather than prevent through specific risk awareness, enabling confident rather than fearful travel through concrete knowledge regarding specific warning signs, observation. While nothing could compensate for the devastating loss her family experienced, the systematic improvements her case inspired created possibility that others might avoid similar tragedy through better preparation, earlier recognition of warning signs, and improved support resources, addressing specific vulnerability factors before isolation barriers limit perceived options. When controlling behaviors emerge behind friendly facades, where public performance gives way to private reality that Sarah discovered too late to escape when initial charm revealed dangerous truth beneath carefully maintained appearance of cross-cultural friendship, that violence exposed as calculated methodology rather than genuine connection. Her case now helps others recognize before similar tragedy might otherwise repeat. Without the educational resources her foundation continues developing, ensuring her memory serves protecting others through knowledge transformation that represents perhaps the most meaningful memorial possible, given circumstances that no justice system alone could adequately address. Despite comprehensive case resolution, her family's advocacy efforts ultimately achieved through persistent determination, ensuring accountability despite institutional barriers initially limiting appropriate investigation. Her case ultimately received through extraordinary individual commitment. Detective Demir provided beyond standard procedural requirements, creating justice foundation. Her family's advocacy transformed into educational legacy, continuing protection provision long after legal proceedings concluded.